Whenever I can, I like to bring in contemporary philosophers, philosophers from at least like the past 100 years or whatever, for you guys to read and engage with. But when we're talking about metaethics, David Hume is way too important to miss off. And since he is the reading that you guys have for this module, it'll be important to kind of dive into what he's talking about. Because, trying to read Hume is going to kind of be like trying to read Shakespeare, but if Shakespeare were doing philosophy, so like even harder. So we're going to go through his arguments, go through what he's talking about, and try and get a good understanding of what he's doing before you guys dive into that reading. Let's get started. So Hume was a super famous Scottish philosopher, lived in Edinburgh his whole life, went to the University of Edinburgh. He originally, I think, was going to do law stuff and then just fell in love with philosophy, as you do. But we're going to be looking at arguments that he gives, two related ones, for the idea that morality is not derived from reason. It's not like a reason thing. It's more of like an emotion thing. And then a very famous problem that Hume identified called the is-ought problem, or the is-ought fallacy. These arguments are tricky, so I'm going to make sure that we kind of spend our time unpacking them. These first two arguments take a little bit of groundwork too, okay? So I'll make sure when I'm talking about groundwork, and I'll make sure we're talking about when we're talking about the argument itself. So here's Hume's first groundwork for his first argument. We have to kind of understand how David Hume thought about objective truth, or at least like truth that kind of like derived from your faculty of reason. Now, he put these into two categories, and these are like the only two categories that he identified. What he called matters of empirical fact. These are things that like require going out and investigating, doing some kind of like observation or something like that, some kind of experience. And then there's relations of ideas. These are statements that are like just true by definition. Bachelors are unmarried. Triangles have three sides. If you just give me the definition of what a triangle is, I can tell you, oh, well, triangles have three sides. That's true. And I don't have to like go look at any triangles. I don't have to go like survey a bunch of bachelors to see if any of them are actually married, right? No, as long as I know what a bachelor is, then I know that that person's not married. Whereas these matters of empirical fact require investigation. These two categories here, this is just what philosophers call Hume's fork, right? Two options, you got to pick one. Now, nowadays, we don't really think this is true. There's a lot of like cross-cutting between these ideas, but this is Hume's argument. This is what we're after. I think this is something that can be very easy to forget, but very important to remind you guys of, that when we're doing philosophy, you're used to maybe like, reading a biology textbook and it's telling you like, hey, here's the way things are. You're reading a chemistry textbook, like, here's how chemicals react to each other. We are reading individual people's arguments from history, and they might be just completely wrong. And that's okay. Our goal is to like understand what the argument is and try to engage with it. So this is Hume's background for his argument. These two kinds of truths, matters of fact and relations of ideas. Here's his argument that this is based on. So if you've got a truth that's derived from reason, it's in one of these two categories, right? We just talked about it. Relations of ideas or matters of fact. So premise one is what we just talked about, Hume's fork. Might be false, but again, this is just what he thought. Now, premise two says that moral claims are not relations of ideas, right? They're not true by definition. There's nothing sort of like inherent in the definition of stealing that includes wrongness or whatever. There's nothing in the sort of like, if I say, oh, so-and-so punched somebody in the face, like that doesn't include the definition of wrongness in it. So they're not true by definition, moral claims aren't. And they're not matters of empirical fact, Hume says. They're not the kinds of things we can go investigate. Like, what am I going to do? Like, go get a moralometer and go investigate the morality of a situation? Like, no. So, if it's derived from reason, it's got to be one of these two things. It's not a relation of ideas. It's not a matter of fact, so it can't be derived from reason. This is just a modus tollens, right? If they're derived from reason, then they're this. They're not that, so they're not derived from reason. This is a really interesting argument. Problematic first premise, but this is how Hume thought about the world, so we'll engage with it. Here's another related but separate argument from Hume. And again, this is just the background for that argument. So this has to do with Hume's theory of action. And we're not going to like take a super deep dive into here, but what he says is that we just sort of find ourselves with desires, right? He calls these passions. And they're not the kinds of things that are reasonable or unreasonable, right? They're just sort of, they're just there, right? And it's our reason that then figures out how to get what we want. So reason, he says, is this slave to the passions. It it does what the passions are demanding. So whatever you end up doing, that is because you wanted to do it. Now, this has some implications for his view on free will and stuff like that, which are really interesting to talk about. But our focus here is just, look, our passions are things that we just kind of find ourselves with, and they are the motivating factors for us. Moral claims, on the other hand, right? Moral claims, they do motivate us to act. But like regular beliefs, they don't. Now, let me give you an example that might help you with this. Let's say I'm standing on some train tracks and I see there's a train headed towards me. So I form the belief that there's a train headed towards me. Is that belief, this belief state that there's a train headed towards me, is that enough to move me off the tracks? No. What gets me to get off the tracks is that desire, that passion to not get hit by a train, right? If I wanted to get hit by a train, if I had that desire, I would stay on the tracks. So it's our desires that motivate us to act, our passion states, not our belief states. So beliefs about truths and stuff, about objective reality, that's not enough to motivate us to act. But moral claims do motivate us to act, so they can't be beliefs about objective reality. These are closer to passions, to emotions, things like that. And I think that kind of makes sense. I think this is maybe a little bit stronger of an argument. And finally, we get this really, really famous argument from Hume. And you're going to read about it in the reading that we have. And he's talking, he notices something in philosophical discourse when philosophers are talking about stuff. And he's like, look, they'll start by talking about what is the case. This is happening, this other thing is happening. And then it's almost imperceptible, but they start talking about what ought to be the case. So how is that move happening? How can you go from what is the case to what ought to be the case? Here's an example of an argument that tries to do that. So premise one just says killing for fun is wrong. And the conclusion says you ought not kill for fun. Now that might make intuitive sense to us, but it is not a valid argument, right? That's not modus ponens, it's not modus tollens, it's not any of the five famous forms we talked about. It might sort of intuitively flow, but this is not a valid argument. Where on earth did this conclusion come from? It can't have come from that premise. Now, we could turn it into a valid argument, right? We can add a premise that sort of bridges the gap between what is the case and what ought to be the case. So premise 2, we can add this and say, hey, if something's wrong, then you ought not do it, so you ought not kill for fun. Okay, we got a valid argument now. This is now just a modus ponens. Hooray, we did it. But Hume's going to be like, where did this come from? Where did premise 2 come from? Like, what reason do you have to like think that this is like true? Right? You can't derive a statement like this from other argumentation. What support do we have for premise 2? So it just seems to come out of nowhere from the normative realm, and we're talking about the descriptive realm. What is the case? So this is the is-ought problem that Hume identifies, and is still a really interesting problem today. I'm going to mention 2 quick responses to the is-ought problem. The first one just has to do with the fact that, like, we can derive facts about some topic from things that like aren't about that topic, or we can take statements from a topic and derive statements outside of that topic, right? You know, we can derive psychological conclusions from non-psychological premises. We can derive economic principles from non-economic premises, right? So this, what's called a domain of discourse, the sort of topic that you're talking about, you can sort of make that shift. We do this. This isn't like that mysterious of a thing, right? There's a lot of different domains of discourse that kind of draw these sort of ought conclusions, these normative conclusions, and we don't seem to find that all that mysterious. So, okay, so maybe there's something here. We've also got a response in the form of goal-oriented language, and this is a really, really interesting idea. Here is a claim that seems to make total sense, right? If you want to win the chess game, you ought to move your queen to b7. Where did this ought come from? Well, it's an ought of a goal, right? If this is a goal you have, here's something you ought to do. And it certainly seems like morality might fall within that picture of goal-oriented language. If you want to benefit humanity, if you want to increase human welfare or decrease human suffering, these are the things you ought to do. So maybe morality is this kind of goal-oriented language. Either way, though, Hume has got a really interesting argument. We've got a lot of really interesting material to think about. And I know this was quick, so just a quick recap of everything we've talked about. There were 2 very closely related arguments. This had to do with Hume's fork, right? Relations of ideas and matters of fact. And since moral truths don't fall into either one, they don't derive from reason, or they're not like objective facts. And then we've got this claim about that, or this argument rather, that moral claims motivate us to act, but objective beliefs don't, right? They can't. And this is the example, you know, the train's headed towards me. My belief that a train is headed towards me isn't going to get me to do anything. It's only my desire to not get hit by a train that's going to cause me to get off the tracks. So 2 tightly related arguments, both trying to get at the idea that morality doesn't come from reason, or maybe like isn't objective. And then we've got this idea that, like, where are these normative, these ought claims even coming from? How do we even get like a valid and sound argument with the conclusion that we ought not do something? It seems like any premise that we have is kind of question begging. And we looked at 2 quick responses to that. Now, Hume sort of fits here because you can sort of take especially these 2 arguments as arguments for a kind of subjectivism, right? Maybe morality is just like emotions or inner preferences or something like that. Or you could take it even sort of further, and a lot of philosophers take Hume to maybe be arguing for a sort of proto-early version of moral nihilism. So that's what we're going to talk about next time. I'll see you then.